Good morning, beautiful people of the internet, and welcome once more to the Sunday Special Live. Joined as always by Helen Chorley, who is looking bright and beautiful and wide awake and happy and special. We have Adam Lawrence, who has been with us since the very beginning, and he is in subtropical Midlands, enjoying the weather, the birds, the cheeping, the chirping, having a great time. Then you have Piotr, who is probably beachside. It's a 5-minute walk from where he lives. And there's me. I had a beautiful day yesterday. I went to a wedding. It was stunning. I didn't drink too much because I had to drive, but I'm planning on drinking today. So never put off for tomorrow what you can do today. And that was my mistake yesterday. So I'm going to get on it. But as always, we're going to be talking about property, economics, everything, anything and everything. But we've got a really good subject to follow on from Adam's Cliff Notes. So let's get the Cliff Notes going. And remember to make sure that you're in the chat, because we'll put the links to everything, so you know what we're referring to when Adam kicks off his speech.
Yeah, so I made no apology for the 6,138 word tome that I knocked out yesterday.
Wow.
It was, but yeah, we're borderline dissertation level. I know it's got to stop somewhere, but because yesterday I happened to have a bit of time on my hands because my family were travelling, so I was home alone, and it's a very dangerous thing to do. Man, computer, obsession with economics, obsession with property. What do you get when you mix all those things together? Bang, you get 6,138 words. So,
you could be doing.
for some time, I've had this idea that, and I've been banging the drum for a while, that we watch the wrong metrics. You know, we watch the metrics that suit the tapestry and the storyline and the hard left protests outside the landlord investment show or whatever. And we don't really care, or nobody cares enough to really do the legwork to work out what the real data looks like. So one of my least favourite tropes that I see is, in 1950 it was only 2.5 times salary to buy a house, and now it's 17 times, whatever. It's like, but in 1950 you got paid 3 shillings and sixpence, so you do need to bear that in mind. So and there was no speakable leverage because the interest rates were, fairly significant apart from anything else. So I've seen that addressed a few times over the years by looking at the percentage of your disposable income that goes in mortgage payments, for example, or rent. That's quite a good one. It's quite a good, quick and dirty way of looking at something a lot more realistically. But really, the only way to put it into context is to look at house prices adjusted for inflation and wages adjusted for inflation, and look at what I've called this week the real multiple. So how many times your inflation adjusted average weekly earnings, all used with proper statistics from the ONS and all the rest of it. So what's the real multiple of house prices versus your average earnings? And it turns out that today it's actually cheaper than it was in the 1980s, or at least a portion of the 1980s, to buy a house in terms of multiples of salary. So that's pretty mind-blowing, really, when you think about it, and kind of what's everybody complaining about. 35 years and it's cheaper. It's actually 9.6 times the average inflation-adjusted salary today, whereas it was up in the 11.2 or so in 1989. So then I can hear the counter arguments already. I could hear them in my ears last night. I was having a great conversation with myself. I'm not sure quite how multipolar I am these days, but I thought, well, you know what though, gas and electric are more expensive, and blah blah blah. So I also tried to look from the ONS, looking at how food prices have developed over the years, how energy prices have developed, and what percentage of the household income they might be taking. And actually, as it turns out, if you try and combine rent costs, and rent tends to take a slightly higher percentage than mortgage, although it's not considerably different over the years, and food costs and energy costs, then if you went back to October 2012, which is the first year where the data is particularly well organized at the ONS, you were looking, and bear in mind 2012, we'd had the crisis, we'd had a correction, we had a bit of inflation, actually, we got up to about 5%. And that's because the economy was kind of racing forward because it had all this loose monetary policy and easy money and funding for lending and all the rest of it. But you were left with about 52% after your rent and shelter costs, after your food, after your energy costs. And even up today, where those costs have obviously ballooned on the other end, because there's been a 40% increase in wages since then, you're actually left with about 53%, not 52, even with these vastly increased energy bills, food bills, massive food inflation, as we all know. So actually, the average, it does feel like an awful lot of fuss about nothing. And in reality, of course, people who've paid, I focused a fair bit on 5-year mortgages and looked at the progression of pay in the last 5 years, the progression of house prices in the last 5 years, and just to try and get an understanding of where you really should be at. There's quite a helpful table that the Bank of England publish that's contributed to by all the major lenders, where they talk about a number of things, such as what are you offering today for a 60% loan to value, 2-year, 5-year fix, and it's kept quite up to date. The data's up till June 23, so it publishes it once a month. And the one thing that's of note and an alarm potentially in there is the one thing that's really progressed, because we've got to a stage where the bond yields have kind of hit, or they're there or thereabouts where they were when Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng were at their peak of trying to destroy the economy in the best way that they could, and that the bond yields are now kind of back up there. But what's changed is the variable rate, the reversion rate on the mortgages. And I think this is something I'm going to talk about further in weeks to come, but we're at about 7.54% average reversion rate. So as soon as you've dropped off a fixed rate, that's where you're at. Now, in a 5-year scenario, you're probably still okay. It's about 37% above what you were stress tested at, but prices have moved on in those 5 years and wages have moved on in those 5 years. In a 2-year scenario, especially if you paid at or above the market value, as so many people did, it's a very different story, because wages have only progressed about 12-13% in that time. And you're talking a difference between a pay rate of 1% and a stress test of 5.5% and a pay rate of 7.5%. And it's very possible that if you overpaid, you might also be in negative equity, or if you bought a new build or something like that. So there is a problem there. There's no two ways about it. There's probably a number of ways that it can be solved, but I think probably need to leave that for another slightly shorter, let's say, follow up to this lot. And then other than that sort of fairly bombshell piece of news, that I can't imagine anything that could upset Just Stop Oil or Generation Rent or Acorn or other, or Shelter, or any other relatively aggressive organisation that really, in real terms, things haven't gone up that much at all. I had to do a comprehensive analysis of rents on the back of it, because I could see people say, well, but rents are so much more than they were. And actually, unfortunately, that's not true either. Rents are taking a couple of percent less of the household income than they were about 10 or 11 years ago. Now, why is that? Well, it's because rents are sticky downwards, right? So for many years, landlords have not tended to raise rents during tenancies, and tenancies are quite long, so they lag quite significantly. That's changed a fair bit, but the ONS, which has a pretty good sample of about 500,000 rents, I mean, it's a very robust sample, they're reporting 5% year-on-year increases now, whereas HomeLet, that report the new tenancy prices, are reporting more like a 10%. But when you put that into context with 8% pay rises and 10+% minimum wage rises, all that's happening is it's increasing in proportion with wages, and therefore it's not going up as a percentage of income. So what does that tell us, really? The important conclusions, really. Number one, in real terms, houses look really relatively cheap right now within the context of the last 40 or 50 years, right? And that sounds ridiculous, I know. How have we got there? Well, because of inflation, because inflation has ravaged things so much. Does that mean that I think the market's going to go up and it's all the rest of it? Absolutely not, because I was surprised to the extent to which my hypothesis was true, right? And I'm pretty disaffected and I'm pretty rooted in the data, and I kind of feel like I've got quite a good handle on this stuff before I even do the work, right? And I was surprised in what I concluded. So the market's really based on emotion. It's not really truly based and rooted in fact. And the media is based on what they want to get out of a situation, as you well know. And so that's why I don't think I was really surprised to see that, but I don't think it'll turn around immediately. I think the multiple's going to drop and drop more because inflation's going to carry on. And with these concerns and with these new, it's not so much even the pay rate for new properties, because that's still not too much above the 5.5% stress test. It's that the stress test has to move. So the stress test has to move to 8%, 8.5%, something like that, because those words are the key words, right? Stress test. It's trying to test what happens under a time of stress. And ultimately, we're beyond the stress test we've used for the last 10 years. So the stress test has to move. And that limits affordability. And that will clog up. Traditionally, first-time buyers have been your 2-year mortgage product users in general, right? It's going to clog up that. There's no help to buy at the moment. It's going to stop the front end moving. If the front end doesn't move, then the second steppers don't move, right? And the fact that prices are going sideways and downwards, and the press is busy making that a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think we're destined for lower transactions. We're destined for a quiet August this year, and there'll be all sorts of
in the most recent months, like the end users were the most kind of active people buying things, because investors dropped off like a year ago, pretty much. And it was mostly like just end users buying their own houses, doing things because of the need, the life needs. So if that also drops off, then the transactions were lower.
Well, that'd be interesting actually, because I know you guys have a good handle on the EIG monthly reports and stuff like that. If there's been much more stock appearing as yet, but on the open market, there's certainly a bit more stock appearing. Although this doesn't mean that everything's going down everywhere in the country, because the right stuff is still selling really well. Yeah. So
that's really the case. It's most of the properties that have limited kind of audience, and
so people will kick the tires, and they'll try. But what happens in these situations, and even though there was a cash crunch in 2008, a significant one, you still saw lots of people be able to hold on. London was fairly notorious for being able to ride the wave. You didn't need to sell, you just didn't sell. Now there's a lot more capitalization out there these days than there was, which means even fewer people, I should say, to be correct, even fewer people who need to sell, and therefore transaction volume is likely to drop significantly. And a lot of estate agents have built great businesses on the back of giant volumes of transactions. In 2021 specifically, we're well above the historical average, and 2022 wasn't half bad either. But unfortunately, those transactions that took place then a lot of those were borrowed from the future because of things like stamp duty holidays, and now they're going to pay those prices on the sales side because there just won't be as much stock coming up, because you're only going to sell if you're motivated. So this is where the market and the data struggles to capture the feeling of the difference between putting a house on the market and achieving an over asking price offer in a few days, which is what we were doing when we were selling in early 2022 a number of times over, and really struggling and battling to get to the top of the Rightmove listing, get people through the door and get them to commit to transacting, because nobody wants to catch the falling knife. And this is where it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. But the firepower's there, right? The capital's there. And it's also somewhat to do with how well a bank of mum and dad capitalised to move people on, because the motivation to buy as a whole in the UK will not go away. We are just a nation obsessed with buying property. But it's going to be slow moving. It's going to be sludgy. And with 20% fewer transactions, maybe something like that, maybe transactions might be 40% down on 2021, 30-40% down. I wouldn't be surprised. By the time it washes out, you're just going to see prices moving sideways and dribbling downwards slightly as inflation continues to pelt the real price of housing and continues to give people more money in their pockets. But the positive news from the back of all of that is, I think there's still loads and loads of nominal upside in property that people maybe aren't seeing at the moment. And there's still quite a safe progression of rents, even though people are shouting at the top of their voice, it's unaffordable, it's ridiculous, it's all the rest of it. The data shows something completely different, and the data has no political truck or bias or anything. It's just the data.
It's like Jay always says, it's context, isn't it? And you can't take these numbers on their own. Like you need to know what the rest of it is around it. So that's great to kind of put that into context. From kind of like a personal anecdote from me, like I'm thinking about selling my flat in London. I've been thinking about, you know me, I'm so tortoise. I've been thinking about selling it since last December. And January, I was like hounded, and I mean hounded, by estate agents, which they're obviously very good at. And it's been crickets for the last, I don't know, 3 months. So that's you know, personally what I'm seeing.
Do you think that's them cutting their marketing reach, really, Helen? Pretty much.
Yeah.
I tell you what I've started seeing more of is all of a sudden the last 6 weeks, my inbox has been filling up with agents sending deals all of a sudden. All of a sudden, they can't just rely on sticking it in the window or on Rightmove. Now they're going to have to actually do some bloody work for it. And I kind of thought that's a really good sign of like when the momentum shifts, right? Because you can look at the professionals in the market, the agents, the auctioneers, the lettings agents, whoever, and you can see how they shift their focus based on the level of work and effort they need to put in to get a deal done. So I've been seeing a bit of that. I've been chuckling a bit because I spoke to one of these guys maybe October last year, and I basically said, look, this deal's too expensive. You're trying to sell it based on fully let in a 2018 market. It's never going to sell. It was a commercial building. And he basically told me how much I know nothing. And then I got an email through on Friday with it listed 150 grand less than what he had it on in October. So I was like, okay, well, I think it can come down a little bit further because it's still silly money. Because I mean, things are taking longer to let on the commercial side anyway. And it's the sign of the times. It really is. But a lot of this, I see a lot of this stuff as kind of the law of unintended consequences kicking in. Now, the law of unintended consequences can run rife when you have idiots as primary actors, not having a single clue as to what it is that they're doing, supposed to be doing, or how things actually work and operate. So I saw a post from Ben Beadle, who I've met a couple of times. Really nice chap. And he was basically, there's the Financial Times Advisor.com put out an article saying the government must act fast to help UK's renters. So then Ben's response to this was, we have a ludicrous situation whereby the tax system actively supports the provision of short-term lets over long-term homes to rent. He's correct. Why government must address the supply and demand crisis urgently is covered in his opinions for the Financial Times Advisor. That's what he's written. So I thought I would write a very, very short poem. Basically, all alliteration, right? So I said, the pandemic of pandering populist politics plagued the PRS. Doggedly determined to destroy the dogma of domicile dependence. And I left it there. I've got one like.
Tough crowd. Tough crowd.
You've got 3 more here. We just have to press. Yeah, I
mean, come on. I think I'm putting quality out. Is it too highbrow? Is it too abstract? I don't know. I thought it was pretty good.
I like it a lot. It's got 7 likes from me.
You got 3 likes.
Very
also,
good.
I know you mentioned the landlord investor show. I saw on Instagram that someone that we all knew was almost attacked by a crowd of protesters and was rescued by security. What a harrowing experience that must have been.
Yeah, I think I'm sure it was all in the interests of having a good debate and nothing to do with getting some clicks on the next YouTube video. But in fairness, it's unfortunately really unsurprising, isn't it, that no real debate is actually attempted to be entered into here? Because, as I've just said, I would absolutely love to debate anybody who wants to from the generation rent side about the facts and figures that I've produced this weekend. You know, It's just I've just laid out the data as it goes. So unless you've either got to question the integrity of the ONS, or that there are meaningful conversations to have around it, because what I haven't covered, for example, is the disparity of income and the spread, the distribution of income. But while we have this horrific, just unacceptable, arbitrary definition of poverty being 20% below the median, which sees people in poverty that just are not, makes you laugh when you consider what poverty looks like in Central Africa, for example. Again, it's just having the wrong conversation, and we need to have realistic conversations whereby things are proportional to what you're bringing in and the sacrifices that are made, rightly or wrongly. And a lot of the people that are, it is unfair that a certain demographic of the population, especially people who are having children, which we need in order to move the workforce forward, apart from anything else, over the next however many years, because the only alternative is more and more immigration. Then there does need to be a level of support that's there, which is ideologically not lined up with what the current administration want to do. But really, the problem, if you will, despite our failure to build houses, despite all of that, still looks roughly the same as it's looked for some time. What's happening at the moment in reality is there are large adjustments being made for slack in, for example, the rental market progression over the last nearly 20 years. It was the case that rents, when they're compared to average wages, I didn't put this in today because something had to not make the cut for 6,138 words, but in January 05, you were looking at a ratio of about 0.67. So I was using rents adjusted for inflation versus wages adjusted for inflation, and I was comparing the two indices. So it's quite difficult to understand, but the 0.67 doesn't really mean anything, right? But it's like a ratio rather than anything else, right? So that 0.67 was the number in 05. That number today is 0.57. And what that's saying is that's how much more wages have moved on than in real terms compared to rents in real terms, right? So to go from 0.67 to 0.57, 0.1, it's about 15 or 16% cheaper, right, than it was in 05. Now, that tells you how much headroom there is. And that's why I introduced the food and the energy, because they weren't taking quite such a big slug of the pie back then. So we do need to bear that in mind. But this situation is not worsening, right? It's just adapting very quickly and moving back to where it was in, I don't recall in 2005 there being gigantic movements against rents in the UK in general. Probably one of the big changes is that, who would have thought you'd hear Lisa and Andy say that basically rent controls don't work? But it's good to see that the Labour Party are hopefully going to implement some stuff they think works rather than appeals to an ideological base. But let's see. It's the pace of change that's causing the problem rather than where the change is actually getting to, is kind of what I'm saying, really.
I think it's a really interesting environment, because you can see the cause and effect of these things playing out in real time. And if you were to, some of the stuff, like I was just thinking a minute ago, about the protests at the Landlord Investor Show, which is why I brought up the funny anecdote. But the reality is, I grew up in council housing. I'm not ashamed of that. I've mentioned it several times. And I at that time, I don't think, bear in mind this is like late 80s, early 90s, right? I don't remember there being many people in the vicinity of where I was that were renting privately. Almost everyone was either owned their own house, or it was renting through the local authority or a housing association, XYZ. And I remember at the time thinking that the living standards are obviously quite young, but it wasn't palatial. If there was something wrong, you were put on a waiting list for someone to come and fix the fence or the guttering or whatever. And there was so many people that were disenfranchised with this kind of centralized housing, which sounds very communist, socialist, depressing kind of you will live in a ghetto whether you like it or not kind of approach. And now you're seeing the shift to private landlords. Now it's and obviously there is now a decent mix of the PRS, housing associations, local authority stock X, Y, and Z. But I think we mentioned this a while ago. I mean, you got all of these rules and regulations about, you know, damp and all these other things. But you look at the local authority stock has it, and they're no better at dealing with it than the private landlord. The housing association have the same issue, and in fact, their stuff that comes up for auction is absolutely disgusting. And the auctioneers shout about it. This is Notting Hill Housing Association. This is such and such. I didn't mean to pick on them. This is such and such housing association, right? And you look at it and you think, wow, you know, the person who was living here must have been living here 50, 60 years. It's no better. It's no worse. So I think the reason people are fighting out is because they see the private rental sector as the primary issue. Well, I would say that's only been the case the last 15 years, in earnest, in size and in definitely in size of the PRS in the last 15 years.
I would call housing association a bit of a private sector as well, because they are mostly for-profit companies, with the exception that they're exempt from all the regulations that all the other landlords have to follow.
Well, who gets paid more, the average CEO of a housing association or you or me? I mean, let's face it, it's no contest. You know, their pay packets are exceptional. It's nearly running Thames Water into the ground or whatever else you wanted to compare it to, realistically. And they're so big, they have so much power. These ones that own 100,000 homes, 200,000 homes, you know, they're utterly bulletproof when it comes to lobbying and the government and all that. And of course, they can raise debt so very, very cheaply, because they've got the greatest underlying asset class. So even in this environment, they can raise debt at tiny fractions above the bond yields, whereas we've got to pay maybe 2.5% above, and the rest of it, and the frictional costs, and jump through all the hoops and blah blah blah. So, I mean, the thing is, the going back to some of Ben's excellent points that you raised, Jay. The thing is, ultimately, the PRS was heading towards 20% and beyond of the sector, whereas now it's nestling back in at around 17% of people that it's housing, and the social sector's housing around about the same number, 16 to 17%. I did some numbers. I know it will surprise everybody that I would have done any numbers, but I did some numbers for the social housing seminar that we ran at PIP last weekend that Sue organised so skillfully, and it was actually the size of the sector and the progression of the sector over the last 10 years and the outcomes actually really surprised me. Now, some of these figures are slightly tardy in terms of their release, so we do need to be a bit cautious. But the fact is, the sector hasn't particularly grown in a material way over the last 10 years. It's kind of relatively flat. And 56% of people who go into social are on a waiting list for less than a year. Now, you wouldn't believe those stats if you read the papers or you heard people talk about it. But again, the data is the data. I'm not saying it's fantastic. It's probably in a similar issues in comparison to the PRS in terms of as a tenant, as a customer of either sector at the moment. But it's not degrading. Now, the condition of properties might be degrading because ultimately, as the time goes on, I saw an article yesterday while I was doing some of this research, which potential interest, which was saying how much subsidence they're expecting in London, specifically over the next 40 years. But again, it was written with a global warming tilt to it, and it's the extremities of weather. And look, when we have a day like we did within the last sort of 12 months, where the temperature varies by 17 degrees in one day, from very cold to very warm, that does cause issues with cracking and the likes that there is. But in reality, the big elephant in the room the article didn't even bother to address is, in 40 years' time, all the buildings that already exist are 40 years older, right? So that in itself, and you can't really, how can you attempt to write an article about something like that without recognizing that point up front? I don't know, but only because you have an agenda rather than a
or just simple geology, that half of London is built on London clay. Play.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's take all the science and all the reason out of it. Let's get some points to and some happy pills to pop to kind of
And it's all a bit miserable because actually some of these solutions have moved on quite a lot in the last 10 or 15 years. It's not the case anymore. It's just a straightforward bit of pinning. There's resin. There's all the the
and will continue to do so.
Exactly. So it's just but it just fits in with the tapestry of this. Woe is me. This is how terrible it all is, and it's kind of like, why don't we, instead of moaning about it, and this is what I see. I mean, since the sub went down, I've never seen as I don't know why I do it to myself, but I follow quite a number of relatively aggressively left-leaning influencers, or wingefluencers, I prefer to call them.
I do the same thing. I don't know why I do it to myself. I do the same thing.
Hey, mate, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. You know the rules, right? You know the rules. But
also, to build yourself a more rounded view, sometimes in there somewhere is going to be a relevant point where you sit back and go, well, fuckity doo dah, I didn't think of that. Well, how does that play out now? But it's being of all sides and none, almost.
I totally agree.
Jordan Peterson, Jay. Very Jordan.
With the fucking doo-dah or something else.
Yeah, he says take the opposite side and argue for it, so you really get your head around where someone else is coming from. And when you're so you're holding on so tightly to one side of an argument, that's a huge leap to do, but by God, is it mind expanding and brain expanding when you do that.
Totally. I did some of the other work I did for last weekend was around the cost of rough sleeping and the cost of homelessness, and some of the work that's been done by organisations to see. I can understand this in a very sort of bloodless economic kind of way, but the reason why it's worth throwing quite a lot of money at stopping rough sleeping and homelessness, just as it is worth throwing quite a lot of money at people coming out of the care system, is because if 25% of those people at the moment go into the prison system, there's a cost of 45k a year for keeping them in the prison system, and therefore you can amortize some of that and work out why you should bring it forward. But the trouble is the same logic applies to immigration, because if you can attract and bring in people of high skill who are in their 20s, they're likely to pay tax for the next 40 years if they stick it out in the UK, right? So it's the reverse of the problem we're having in the NHS at the moment, where people come in and do their degrees and then they're whipped off to Australia or similar as soon as they finish, because they're earning to double the money. Sometimes Australia are deliberately targeted advertising the UK because they love the UK system and they love the doctors that we knock out, and it makes sense for them to nick them. Now we're furious about that, although realistically the brain drain normally flows into the UK, not out of it, and we've been doing it for 70 years or something like that. But the system needs fixing, or at least tweaking in some of these departments. But we need these longer term views, not the shorter term views that drive everything, and the ideology, whether it's on the left or the right, that just drives incorrect decision making. It was something like the cost in 2015 assessed of homelessness, rough sleeping, because you do have to make the distinction. Rough sleepers was about 20k a year to the purse, but there was an effective intervention program with a high success rate that was costing about £1,500 a year. And so you were getting a gigantic return on that money by expanding that program. What happened instead? Austerity decided to reverse that program and shut it down. And therefore you've got a bigger problem now than you ever had. And you're paying, what's that, about 1,500, nearly 13, 14 times the amount of money that it's now costing because you did it that way. It's just crackers. But these sort of proper business cases, as I call them, are just so poorly understood and put forward. It's just made on what are the optics, what are the sound bites, what aligns with the left or the right, or whoever the governing councillors are in the LA, or whoever's on the committee in Parliament. And it's just a real shame.
Yeah, actually, I was in one of the things I was doing in London this week while I was back. I was at the launch of kind of a mental health a free mental health resource and app, and Alistair Campbell was speaking at it. And granted, obviously he has a political lead and he got in a few like actually very obvious sneaky digs, but he was really funny. He was a really good speaker actually, but saying exactly that, like, it's all very well, it's just more expensive to tackle those problems at the end than if you kind of set up things beforehand to tackle the source, the root, the issue of the problem. And that's where he was having a go, obviously his political bent, to have a go at the government, just saying that we started making progress on that and then it all got wiped away. And there we are. Yeah.
I like Alistair Campbell a lot more than I thought I would since I started listening to the podcast that he does with Rory Stewart. It's really good. I referred to it a little bit today in the supplement, because actually they interviewed John Major, and actually he gave a really good account of what he knew needed to be done to vanquish inflation and how they did it. And you might remember, 92, he won a very unlikely election that it looked like Labour were, I think they'd popped the champagne, hadn't they, or whatever. And then by 97, actually they'd sorted everything out. But the political genius that was and still is Alistair Campbell, and the proposition of Labour and the way they went about things was so clever and so good. The economy was growing at 3.5% a year when they turned over the government, and it was one of the great defeats of modern times. If you remember, I think Labour had something like 419 seats or whatever afterwards, because they just got the sound bites and the value proposition right. And it's really interesting to see, and they were able on the back of that to build, 11 years of really good outcomes. And then with the financial crash, but still in 2010, the country was quite a lot better off overall as an aggregate. Whereas Conservatives have struggled through a bit more, and some of that at the bottom end, they certainly feel like they've been left alone for the last 12, 13 years. But there still have been some quite good and progressive policies like levelling up, where they have actually not just talked about it, they've actually done some of it, and the tax system has taken more people out of paying tax than has happened for 50 or 60 years, because the raising of the personal allowance. But nobody talks about that. But similarly, the national debt has gone from about 886 billion, I think it was, to about 2.5 trillion. So they've pretty much trebled it in 13 years, and Labour is supposed to be the party that spends all the money. So something doesn't really stack up there. And of course, if you blame some of that on Brexit, that was a self-fulfilling, self-concocted prophecy, right? So the Conservatives got to take the rap for that, because that was their proposition. And we're back to what we were talking about the other week, where they pander to the far right of the party, which makes them difficult to like, because they haven't got the stones which great leaders have had over the years to either say, look, put up or shut up, you're in the church or you're not. Do you want to leave? You want to leave because you can do what were those? Do you remember Chuka Umunna and Anna Soubry and a few other? Was it called Reform? I mean, in fact, I can't even remember what they were called. They lasted for about 12 minutes, didn't they? When they looked like they had a really strong, we can build this middle of the road party or whatever, and they just faded into nothingness. So Johnson, not that he's allowed in the House of Commons anyway, and he's resigned anyway, but Rees-Mogg, whoever else, they know they can't leave the Conservative Party, right? These threats of like joining forces with Farage, it's like, mate, the guy's record in elections is something like 0-11 or something like. He's one of the great losers of modern times, just because they like him on GBBs or whatever does not make him a political threat to anybody, right? So Rishi needs to grow a pair of stones and show the population he's actually got some leadership, because we're going to end up with two potentially quite weak leaders who are not that exciting and dynamic fighting against each other, and possibly, just a really low turnout election, which Labour will probably win. But if they win by, say, 10 seats, let's say, which I don't think is impossible at all, then you'll have a struggle getting policy through. It'll be 5 years of crap, because they're going to have to deal with all of the economic mess that is the malaise that is left behind by these high interest rates and all the rest of it. And still the hard decisions, the John Major decisions. I never would have thought I would have been singing the praises of John Major, but the clarity with which he understood and executed the inflation situation in the early 90s, which is very, very similar, although it came from a completely different place, is very similar to our current inflation situation. And what we're seeing is we haven't tackled it strongly enough, and that's why it's just going to last for absolutely bloody ages.
How do you think, like, this, if Labour gets in power, how it's going to affect Ireland even more? Because at the moment, obviously struggling with interest rates, struggling with I don't know, maybe getting tenants out, doing like all the bad press that's on. And if Labour gets in power, usually that's a place where lots of us were thinking, like last election, of like emigrating and going somewhere else, selling up and doing all these things. I think right now it's even more of a pressure cooker, right?
It's a great question, because, you know, if you go back a couple of years, you know, we were talking earlier about housing associations raising debt very cheaply. I remember in late 2020 an HA bond going to the city, and it sold at a 0.5% yield, right? Now, if you were back in those times, of course, there could be a massive business case for repurchasing of property. And I'm not talking about a legislative forced way to do these things, right? I'm talking about a voluntary scheme whereby landlords could just say, yeah, we'll sell to the LA. I know I'm going to get a district valuer. I'm probably going to get 90 to 95 pence in the pound. But there was a survey done this week which claims that about a third of landlords would be happy to take 80p in the pound on their property value to get out at the moment. And what that is effectively in people's minds is they're giving away their COVID premium, because that's pretty much what the COVID premium adds up to, in order to get out.
From landlords right now saying, like, I've got this property, it's tenanted, what can I get for this? And the conversations are tough, because if properties are tenanted with rents that haven't been increased, or even if they're like at market rent, it still can be difficult to sell tenanted properties because there's no really that many other investors wanting to.
Mate, our offers at the moment are so aggressive, just because that's what the spreadsheet's telling us to do, right? We're pricing in 7.25% interest rate. What do you think we're going to be able to pay for stuff to hold on to? Do you want to flip it in a falling market with a trader's margin? That's never been my model. It's not for me. There's lots of very skilled traders out there who will do it and work to 7, 8, 9, 10, 11% margins. It's not for me. The ticket size is too high, and I'm not skilled enough to know exactly what and where and when to do with it. And there's the falling knife argument, nor am I willing to defraud the stamp duty system like some of them do. But anyway, that's another story for another day. But we all know it goes on. So I think the LAs and the central government could take a more collaborative approach. I mean, I've been banging this drum since I was ever a landlord and went to the first local authority meeting I went to, and I spoke to. They were trying to lease some properties back from landlords, and I was like, look, instead of trying to dictate and say, well, we'll pay 10 or 15% under the LHA rate and we'll do this and we'll do that, I said there needs to be a collaborative way of solving this problem. And, you know, you need to ask the landlords, what do they want? Of course, they're going to try and get as much money as possible, but put yourself in their shoes and come up with something attractive that will work. So a well-executed Labour government could buy back some ex-LA stock and help to support that with a fund that did it. But in the current environment, the interest rate is going to prohibit a lot of that stuff from being able to go on. You know, when you can borrow money at 0.5%, it makes a huge amount of sense to repatriate assets that are going to yield maybe 3 or 4% over time, doesn't it? It's just from an accounting perspective, it's a good thing to do, right? Because the problem you have in a lot of boroughs of London and things like that, especially with some of the suppressed rents that there are, is that they're not even earning 0.5% yield on the value of the property. And that becomes problematic because it's not economically viable. But then it all becomes a big game about pushing money around between what does the LA want to do, stuff that's not on their own balance sheet, right? Because it's what they're cultured into doing. We need to have better conversations, and instead of behaving at governmental level or local level, where we try and falsely move things off balance sheets in order to make it look better than it is, but then create these huge holes with temporary accommodation and things like that. We need to say, no, I'll tell you what the new accounting rules are, right? Everything's on the balance sheet and everything's on the P&L, and we have real and realistic conversations. And then we start looking, and we have a completely new cultural approach to it. We look at what we were just talking about with things like rough sleepers, right? How do we move? Prove to me this works, because there's tens of thousands of studies around the world, right, in places that have made this work. Finland is often cited, but there's lots of other countries where they've made this work really well. Prove to me what happens when we invest more in social housing, right? Of course, we've got the arguments around the damp and mouldy properties and the stuff Jay was talking about earlier. And, you can, what's the saying? You can judge a population by, or judge a country by how it treats its poor or whatever. That's one way of doing it. But I think you just need a new cultural approach that says, right, instead of people trying to cover their backsides, where are the people who are actually going to make a difference? I look to often talk about the Preston local authority model, where one of the things that they implemented was to invest in, so when they tendered for contracts, they would give preferential treatment to people who were within X miles of Preston and or lived in the wider local authority. And do you know what it did? It created jobs, right? It created council tax revenue, local tax revenue. It created business rates revenue, and the area benefited from being a self-perpetuating force, right? So that does need to be considered, and we just need to be smarter than we'll just go with the cheapest option. I filled in a council grant form this week, and the LA I've been working with have been absolutely fabulous about it. We've managed to achieve the grant for the building, which is great news, right? But there's a big bit on the grant form that just says, are you going with the cheapest quote? If not, why not? And it's like, well, that's the attitude. And look, to an extent, I can understand it. But really, the question really should be is, why is this quote the best value for money? Yes. How do you evidence that? Right? That's the question. So we need a cultural shift. But at the moment, Labour really, really need the interest rate to be able to come down, and or find a way of issuing, because these gilt issues are going on week at the moment, and they're issuing it, 4 and 5% coupons and stuff. You just think that's the difference. This is self-fulfilling, very obvious point, right? But the difference between finding positive net present value projects to invest in when your cost of debt is 0.5% and when your cost of debt is 5%, right? It's more than 10 times harder. It's more than 10 times harder, right? So that doesn't help. And how do you get that down? You got to break inflation. You got to vanquish inflation. That's the chat that neither side are really lighting anything up on, because they're too busy trying to talk to their user bases rather than say, do you know what? We don't even need to go abroad for this one. We can learn from what we did in the past, and we can put the UK, powered by AI, powered by whatever else we need, on a platform to actually grow in a meaningful way that will get to the people by investing in infrastructure, by investing in housing, by investing in projects that have a positive return that will help people move from net benefit claimants to net payers of tax. That's what we need to do.
I mean, the first problem that they have is not a single person in government at the moment can tell an inspiring story, which means that all they're able to do is doomsay. Oh, we're talking about Patrick and his wife Kelly from here, and they can't do this and they can't do that because of the mistakes you've made. Well, are they entirely mistakes that someone's made? No. There's law of unintended consequences. There's personal circumstances. There's 50,000 other metrics that are bored into that. So once you take away the fact that none of them can tell a good story, an inspirational story to raise the spirits of the people, to band everyone together, to get through a difficult time. This is wartime. No one wants to call it wartime, but this is wartime. It's a war against inflation. It's a war against socialist politics that are seeking to destroy the foundation of the country. It's a war against tyranny across the seas, right? That's what we're in at the moment. And to pretend it's not is a frightening fallacy that people just need to get over. So once you get over the fact that they're terrible storytellers, no one's really an inspiration, no one's in there saying to everybody, okay, that's bad. What are we going to do about it? Oh, no, let's focus on how terrible it is. Okay, well, let's focus on how terrible it is. Now, what are you going to do about it? Well, that's it. They can't tell a good story and they haven't got a plan between them. Not one that inspires, not one that actually progresses or moves forward. Instead, what happens is you start to try and politicize things that shouldn't be politicized. The Bank of England shouldn't be politicized. The royal family shouldn't be politicized. local government not being transparent with their expenditure and what goes on and off of their balance sheet shouldn't be politicized. What should be happening is there should be a coherent message. Both sides across that little bipartisan shelf that they all shout from should be looking at each other going, well, this isn't working. This petty little jab. I watched it the other day. I was on like Talk TV or something. I was on whatever it was. And the whole time they were just taking the piss out of each other. They were just making little jabs and people were standing up and going, oh, that's not that. What do you expect to happen in an environment where all you're doing is playground politics, taking the mickey out of someone on the other team, and then like backhanded compliments? So, well, are you actually running the country, or are you mugging off your mate that joined the other team?
Such a waste of time, because the amount of
I
know the amount of person hours wasted in PMQs is nobody's business. These people who are so very busy, and I know that they are busy. It's just insane. Good morning, Abby. I think the party was that a party political broadcast for the Jaber party, but I was very, very impressed by that, and I think we need some more thinking like that at the top of the tree. There's no two ways about it, and whether we'll get it, well, the trouble is no one wants to change the system because everyone is too scared, because everyone says, oh, that doesn't work, that doesn't work. It's like, well, you would get someone like Macron, and I'm not the man's biggest fan by any stretch of the imagination, but I do like the fact that he could kick the system up a bit by doing things a different way and come in and do what was impossible by founding a new party and then trouncing the French presidential election when he did. Might not be the best example at the moment because they're back to Le Pen, gaining ground as we crack on. But we'll have to see.
It's been a tight fight the last two elections there. I mean, she's been edging. I mean, and just look, I mean, the French don't need any real kind of reason to protest or revolt or tear down. And it, I was thinking it's taken them a little while because you had all of those. You had the yellow jacket. That's been going on for 3 years, and now obviously you've had the teenager that was shot, I think, by a police officer. That was recently. You've had those. I mean, it doesn't. It's kindling and someone standing over it at a great height, just knocking off flints and just hoping it catches fire. And you see the same thing here. I mean, there has been protest after protest in the UK recently, and we're not known for protesting in any real shape. The last
just mildly delay sport was my favourite one of the week, actually. The new strap line for Just Stop Oil.
Yeah, I mean it's I think they have valid points, but the way that they put it out is so. I mean, and everyone talks about, these disruption style things have worked in the past. Yeah, it worked in the past.
But some of these comparing Just Stop Oil to the suffragettes, you just want to kick them in the face. I mean,
well, you do, and they're not doing anything near as good. The suffragettes went on hunger strikes. They're like, if this doesn't change, it's being lost. Not, I'm a upper middle class child with a name like Tristan or Francesca or something like that, that's gone to a very liberal university and has now decided that I'm going to do this, and then you've got some soppy bollock boy behind them who just wants to smash, doesn't believe in anything she believes in, and will just act like a fucking idiot because we're young lads. That's what young lads do. But this doesn't actually result in any change. What it results in is people now have no respect for your argument.
Yeah, friend of mine who
it's an argument that needs respect.
Friend of mine that I know from back in hospitality. He's got a real dry sense of humour. Right, he runs a pub. It's a tough enough job. You got antisocial hours. You got to deal with some of the worst bits of the general public some of the time. But he's got a very pithy, very dry sense of humour. And he posted on his Facebook the other day, and he said, "I wish my daddy was rich enough for me to join Just Stop Oil." And it's like you see and it's so true. I mean, it's so true. So let me just say the pod that I was referring to, listening to John Major talk, was one. So Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart have this podcast called The Rest is Politics, which I think is the biggest podcast in the UK. But they have a spin-off podcast called Leading, where they interview interesting leaders. They've done a few. They've done Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, a few people from the other side of the fence as well. Although I don't think Bernie would want to be admitted to be on the same side of the fence as Hillary anyway. And they do two with John Major, one which is about everything leading up and working with Margaret Thatcher and all of that sort of stuff. And then one that's more specifically about his premiership. And it's the second one that is the really interesting one. He speaks very, very well. Man's 80 years old and he's as clear as a bell and as bright as a button. It really is very, I found a newfound respect in him. And then I realised how much, in the 90s, being slightly interested in politics, but all I did was follow the tapestry that the press fed to me. So I actually knew nothing about him and very, very little about, economically what they tried to achieve and what they had achieved. So it's an interesting, especially because him and Alistair Campbell obviously have, let's say, they've probably got a bit of beef from over the years because Campbell was the mastermind that took him down, of course. So, but it's very, very good listening. Very well worthwhile.
I remember John Major being quite unremarkable as like a character, but he was what I obviously read your thing this morning. I was just going over some stuff. I just remember him just being, there was none of this like popularist thing. He just kind of just cracked on. He was like a safe, stoic pair of hands where it just like he trod the path and everyone kind of went along with it. And
he talks about because if you remember, he found quite a nice role for Neil Kinnock within the EU organisation, and they made a collective effort, although they never sort of signed an agreement or had a formal agreement about it. They made a collective agreement to try and get PMQs out of the gutter and make it actually a worthwhile thing. And he says what he's seen since then has just utterly dismayed him because it's gone back to as bad as it ever was or worse. And it's just a complete circus. And as we've already said, a waste of time, which is a real shame. But he was a serious politician who believed in his values, not someone who would sort of kowtow to the fringes of the party in order to try and keep everyone on board because they're a bit politically naive. He's actually, despite the grey spitting image character, a relatively strong leader who dragged the economy out of a real significant slump in the early 90s. Remember all the problems and then proper protests, aka riots about the poll tax and all the rest of that sort of stuff as well. And not easy to govern over that.
I just shared the link to the podcast.
Okay. Oh, sorry. I'm being hassled. I've got some Kit Kat cereal which I keep in the office just to kind of like snack on. I know. And Abby's found the box, so she's been running. So she's found the box, and now she just keeps running in, shouting at me to give her more of them.
Kit Kat cereal.
I didn't know we were doing sponsors, but that looks like a good one. So other cereals are available, right?
Nestle, when you're ready.
Do you post to Malta? Yeah. Take some of that. Might melt.
I think it's. I mean, we've talked about this in various different ways on the chat today, and maybe next weekend we'll do like a proper session on it. But if you're a property investor or a developer or something like that, looking after your financial interests is really important, but looking after yourself and your mental health is also exceptionally important. I know that Helen, when we started the call, was talking about the JAAQ. So that link is going to be out there. That's a resource. Check that out. But in here we've talked about managing this kind of thing, managing that kind of thing, looking at Adam's numbers, telling a good story, focusing, coming together, combining things, working through difficult times. So maybe next week we'll do a bit more of a focus on the investor, the developer, the mental health side of things, just to it's a good check-in because we'll lay ourselves bare a little bit. We'll talk about the bits we struggle with and the bits and what we do to kind of keep ourselves going forward. we're not a massive marketing company, a lot of us, so you know we can be real without worrying that no one's going to sign up to our rent to rent course next week or whatever it is. But also being real helps other people be real and focus on what's actually going on. You know, Seneca used to say, we suffer more in imagination than we do in reality. Yeah. So so if you're stuck in your own mind, if you're a sole operator like most property people are, get yourself to a networking event like Partners in Property, get yourself into a community, open up the chat. Don't stand by yourself. Don't do stuff like that. It's gonna get trickier before it gets easier. That's a good thing and a bad thing depending on at what point in the cycle we're in. So definitely join us next week. We'll have a bit more of a heart to heart.
Yeah, happy to talk more about that. It was a really emotional. It was launching. Actually, it was launching this Jack. Just quickly, this Jack website. Just ask a question. It's kind of an interactive. It uses like super cool AI stuff way beyond me, where you can ask like world leading experts about depression, body dysmorphia, like all types of stuff. You ask them a question and they pre-recorded so many hours, like coming up with like every possible question you could possibly imagine. And Alistair Campbell was talking about it in terms of like, you know, his own mental health journey. That's it. He wouldn't have reached out to anybody, but he might have and actually, you know, kind of somebody kind of had to do an intervention with him. But something like this, if something like this had been available, he might have gone on that. He might have used that. So I would love to talk more about that because the stories and the impact something as simple as this has on people's lives is huge. And the website, that part is free. It's kind of paid for by the when they roll this out to corporates, and that's what the launch was last week. This Jack at Work, and that helps fund the free website. But it's kind of like masterclass and like meets mental health. It's a really cool resource. And Bupa are signed up now, like loads of big names already. So it's
well, there's without pouring petrol on the fire. As a corporation, there's massively, you know, positive economic reasons for investing in this stuff. You know, so yes, positive PR is also a good thing, but there's so much need for stuff like this. You know, if you want to get high performing teams, when you've got layers of management and executives and beyond and all the rest of it, you know, you need to keep those shows on the road. And it's all very well, but if people get to high positions and then burn out in a few years or whatever it is, that's not going to help anybody. And
that's the bit that really, there's a whole I've forgotten the lady's name, but I'll write a post about it this week. But there's a whole thing on burnout, and like the signs for burnout are clear. There are stages, but I really wish I'd known that, because I didn't know, and you don't know till it's too late. And then good luck, you know, then you spend the next 10 years trying to come back from that.
Yeah,
that's not fun.
No, sounds like a brilliant initiative that's going to make the world a better place, and we don't get to say that often enough. So I think that's really positive.
Right. Okay. So next week, mental health. Tune in. Bring your questions, whatever else you've got, and for today, it's a wrap up. And brilliant. Everyone have an amazing Sunday.
Thanks, everyone.